My name is Howard Greenberg. I am the Senior Medical Director of the CPU here at Clini Labs in New York City. I am also Adjunct Associate Professor of Thomas Jefferson University Department of Clinical Pharmacology. And the topic for today's webinar is Investigator Responsibilities, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So I just want to start off with a quick acknowledgement and conflict of interest statement. This material was developed in conjunction with two of my collaborators, Charles Pierce, who's Associate Professor in Cincinnati, and Donna Dorzinski, who is President of a consulting firm based in Pennsylvania area. And the three of us are on the Association of Clinical Pharmacology Units Board of Directors. I am the President this year, and Donna is the incoming President. And we will be presenting a symposium at the DIA meeting in Washington, D.C. in June 2010, and some of this material will be used in that presentation. I do want to express the appreciation of these two collaborators, and I also want to suggest that if anyone is interested in being more involved with the Association of Clinical Pharmacology Units, please check the website and ask any questions you may have. The sources of information for this discussion are threefold, as outlined on this slide. What prompted this webinar was a more recent publication on FDA guidance that was issued a few months ago called Investigator Responsibilities, Protecting the Rights, Safety, and Welfare of Study Subjects. Two of the other resources that are more nuts and bolts that we'll be getting into is the Statement of the Investigator, which is the FDA Form 1572, and the ICH E6 Guidance on Good Clinical Practice, which was published in 1996. So the physician investigator has a dual responsibility, and this is also a potential conflict. He's a physician who has clinical care of the subject and is charged as a physician to look out for the individual's health care. But he is also involved in clinical research and to produce results that are generalizable data that could be used for clinical research findings for a whole population. A discussion of this was in the New England Journal of Medicine article, and it just sort of acknowledges that this conflict is present, and as long as the investigator is aware of it, it could be handled. So the question comes up, and this was from a Time cover magazine of several years ago: is this an accurate perception? Those involved in clinical research like to think not, although there is a lot of public perception that needs to be managed in this regard. So just as a highlight, when you give a presentation, you like to say what you're going to tell the audience, then tell the audience in detail, and then summarize and tell the audience what you had just told them. So just to highlight, I'm going to break down the functions or responsibility of the principal investigator in terms of the protocol review, what to look for. Is the study warranted? Are the evaluations adequate? What's the rationale about the dose escalation, inclusion-exclusion criteria, restrictions, all the regulatory documents? The PI does have the responsibility, as we'll hear about, for the IRB review as well. During the study, the PI has other functions and responsibilities. Safety measures, are they appropriate? Restrictions, other medical therapies, adverse events, as we'll hear about, is a very important attribute and responsibility of the PI. Any changes in the protocol or consent form need to be communicated and implemented, and any new or additional safety data. As far as the wrap-up or post-study, AE assessment is one of the key deliverables of the PI. What to include, how to assess it, how to assess the relationship between the adverse experience and the investigational product, what about lab results, how to handle sponsor suggestions. The case report forms are the data that are the output of the study, and you need to review every page. And finally, the final report is a safety section which the PI signs and may author completely or parts of it, but they need to review it as they're signing it. So the first section of information that I'm going to review is the most recent FDA guidance. When I first saw this, I was thinking it might revamp some of the guidances or theories put forth in the ICH or the 1572, but really it just accentuates and clarifies and reinforces those. So the responsibilities of the clinical investigator are delineated in two of the CFRs, 21 CFR 312 for drugs and biological products and CFR 812.3 for medical devices. The term investigator means an individual who conducts the clinical investigation, that is, who is overseeing and supervising the drug administration and the conduct of the study. If there are many investigators involved, the PI is the leader of that team. So to summarize the investigator responsibilities in a succinct way from this document, the first responsibility is to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of the study subject under the investigator's care. I've called this the good for the purpose of this presentation. That is not an FDA label. The second one is to supervise the clinical study where study tasks are delegated to employees or colleagues or other third parties. As an investigator in over 100 early phase trials, I know the trials and tribulations of doing this, and therefore I label this the bad. There is an investigator statement for either drugs or medical devices, and those are delineated, as I mentioned, in CFR 312 and 812. And then there's the FDA Form 483, which is the Notice of Inspection Observations. And this is issued by the FDA field investigator after an inspection if there are deficiencies of the site. This I labeled the ugly, because if you are cited with the 483, that can carry forth both with you as the investigator, but more particularly as the site. So as I mentioned, the investigator responsibilities for drugs or biologics are listed in CFR Part 312, and it's delineated in the Form 1572, which we'll be going into in more detail, and it's delineated in those parts of the CFR. For medical devices, it's Part 812, and they also share the same CFR parts 11, 50, 54, and 56, which are described here. Part 11 is the electronic records. Part 50 is the IRB, or protection of human subjects. Part 54 is the financial disclosure. I'm sorry, Part 50 is the protection of human subjects. That is the consent forming, and Part 56 is the IRB, and Part 312 is the IND, Investigational New Drug Application. And again, it's Part 812 for devices. So what are some of the investigator responsibilities from my personal perspective? I like to make the analogy it's like being a parent. You are responsible for everything and anything that occurs or happens under your supervision, and you get in trouble if someone else screws up. But overall, it's pretty basic common sense, not rocket science. Again, this is my personal view, not the statement of the FDA guidance. So what are some of the responsibilities that the investigator has? One of the key ones is the staff that the tasks are delegated to needs to be qualified, and the PI needs to make sure that they meet those qualifications. Whether they have adequate understanding and training on how to conduct the study. Whether they are being adequately supervised in the ongoing conduct of the study, and also oversight of any third-party investigators or providers of services, be it x-rays or lab or anything else. The PI has ultimate responsibility for that as well. So what are some of the hot buttons in FDA inspections? Who is obtaining informed consent? Who is doing the screening evaluation or medical history? Who assesses the inclusion-exclusion criteria and whether the subject qualifies? Who's doing the physical exams? who's evaluating the adverse experience and their relationship, who's assessing the primary endpoints. And the final comment is the protocol trumps the state guidelines, meaning if you're in a state where a nurse practitioner could do a physical exam, but the protocol says it needs to be a physician, the protocol rules out and it needs to be a physician. The PI needs to assure that there's adequate training. How familiar is the staff with the study protocol? How familiar are they with the investigational product? Do they know the regulatory requirements? Is the staff competent? And are they kept up to date with any changes? So some of the factors to ensure adequate supervision is how experienced is the study staff? What is their workload like? How complex is the trial? How much data, how many observations? How many subjects are involved? Are they ill subjects or normal healthy volunteers? Are there multiple studies occurring? Are there multiple locations? And is that single investigator overseeing all of this? These are all factors to make sure there's adequate supervision. So what are some of the ways to make sure of this? There's two main ways, routine meetings and having well laid out procedures. You want meetings with the staff before, during, and ongoing during the study. You want to have routine meetings with the sponsor and the sponsor's monitors. You also want procedures to ensure timely correction of problems, good documentation, good consent procedures, good source data collection, addressing data queries, and making sure that the staff complies. You also want to address any medical or ethical issues that arise in a timely manner.
But no, my phone line's being taken because...
So what are some of the other PI responsibilities of other parties? Well, there may be other people or companies that are involved in the study that are not employed by the PI or the site. These are sponsors who share this responsibility if it's done by a SMO. It also might be if the sponsor hires that site that they share in the responsibility to oversee it. But if it's the PI who is retaining the services of the laboratory or the X-ray facility or ECG recordings, the PI retains those services and they have to make sure that they are up to snuff and adequate. The second large area of responsibilities of the PI is protecting the rights, safety, and welfare of the study subjects, one of the headings of the FDA guidance. And this means you have to provide reasonable medical care for the study subjects, reasonable access for their care, either by yourself as the investigator or delegated to a qualified individual who is a specialist or subspecialist in that particular area. And you also have to adhere to the protocol so that the study subjects are not exposed to undue risk. Basically, if the protocol is not followed, the subjects are not benefiting and they're exposed to undue risk. So following the protocol is a key consideration. What is considered reasonable medical care? The primary care physician, if there is one, should be aware of the participation. The PI should also make sure that there is care provided for any adverse experiences, including abnormal lab values. You could handle that yourself, or you could refer it to an appropriate specialist. You should also extend that care past the period of the study protocol, if need be, to make sure there's appropriate follow-up care. And you should also make sure that the subject is apprised if during the screening procedure something is found out that should be followed up. For instance, if there is a ECG finding that indicates the subject is abnormal, you may not qualify him for the study, but he should also be referred to a cardiologist or primary care physician to look into that. So what would be considered reasonable access? Well, you need to be available by phone or email 24 hours, 7 days a week, either directly or more likely through the study team. You need to have reasonable close physical proximity to see the subjects, or have another physician cover for you if you're not available. And the PI could also not be a physician, in which case that PI needs to delegate to a physician to take care of the medical aspects of the study subjects. So just to summarize this section of the talk, these items, 5 items, are the main items from the FDA guidance that the PI is responsible for. Delegation of duties, training of the staff, supervision of the staff, oversight of not just the staff but any third-party facilities that the site uses, and probably most importantly, or should not be taken lightly, is the protection of the rights and safety of the subjects. And that's all the items of appropriate medical care that were delineated previously. Now I'm going to move into the second part, which hopefully will echo some of what the guidance highlighted. And this is the Form FDA 1572. It's also called the Statement of the Investigator. Signing this form, the 1572, is the PI's commitment that he or she is responsible for the study. That means everything to do with the study, and this is delineated in that CFR. And these are all the different CFR sections which talk about the protection of human subjects, the informed consent, the IRB, the IND, and all of the sections. And I just point out that there's an analogous, not a 1572, but an analogous statement of the investigator for medical devices, which is governed under 21 CFR 812. So what does this statement mean? It is a legally binding agreement between the PI and the FDA. The 1572 is required when a drug is used to administer to humans in a clinical trial. And as I said, it's also required, a similar one, when an experimental device is used. So this just shows the outline of the investigator's responsibilities from study participant recruiting through the conduct of the study to the study completion. The 1572 has 9 commitments. So you're signing off on these 9 commitments when you put your name on the bottom of page 2 of the 1572. 7 of the 9 start out with I agree, 1 with I have read, and 1 with I will ensure. By signing this, this is a legal obligation that you are signing your name and reputation to. You should take this very seriously. The first of the 9 commitments is adhering to the protocol. Again, pretty straightforward. You would assume that would be the case, but you are legally bound to adhere to the protocol, and this states that you will follow it. The second commitment is that you will personally supervise this investigation. This in the past has sometimes led to problems with investigators who are spread too thinly. So you are agreeing that you will be involved in the conduct of the investigation. Obtaining the informed consent and the IRB approval. These are processes that can be quite intricate, and you are agreeing to inform the patients of the consent process, and it is a process, as I'll describe shortly, and to make sure that a qualified IRB is reviewing and approving the study. As I said, informed consent is a process. It is not simply getting a signature at the bottom of a page. And this describes what that process is. And the subjects really need time to understand and consider their participation in the study. And you should not be rushing them, and you should be providing any explanation. And in fact, sometimes if English is not their first language, you need to provide the consent form in their first language. You also need to make sure that the IRB approves the study. You need to oversee that the IRB is properly formulated and is doing a good job. The IRB needs to review the following documents: the protocol, the informed consent, any screening or information sheets, and any advertisements. And again, as the PI, you need to make sure this is being done. Reporting adverse events is one of the key goals and responsibilities of the principal investigator. He or she agrees to report to the sponsor AEs that occur in the course of the investigation. AE handling or safety is one of the key functions of the PI. The investigator promptly reports to the sponsor AEs that occur. whether or not it's caused by the drug, and we'll be getting into that in a little bit. If the AE is alarming or serious, this has to be reported immediately. Most protocols, or all protocols, should contain directions for how AEs and serious AEs are to be defined, collected, and reported. These are to be recorded in the case report form. SAEs also require additional reporting within a very short time frame to both the sponsor and the IRB. There may be other unexpected events or special events that also require expedited reporting to the IRB. And again, AEs should be followed up to resolution, stabilization, or until the patient has lost to follow-up. Understanding the information in the investigator's brochure. So the sponsor needs to provide an investigator's brochure, that's an IB, and the investigator needs to make sure he or she has read it and understands it and disseminated the information. The IB contains the following information: a description of the drug substance, how it's formulated, its pharmacology, its toxicology, its preclinical, and to the extent known, what has been found in clinical studies. A summary of the PK, pharmacokinetics, and its biological disposition in animals, and if any previous studies were done in humans. A summary of the safety and effectiveness in humans and the anticipated or possible risks and side effects. That should all be in the investigator's brochure, and this brochure is updated periodically by the sponsor as more clinical trials are evaluated. The sixth responsibility that they sign off is the training of site personnel. You agree to ensure that all associates, colleagues, and employees are informed about their obligations for these commitments. So you need to be responsible for the training of all the site personnel. You need to maintain adequate and accurate records. So you're agreeing to maintain these according to the CFR. And I'll talk a little bit more about what is meant by adequate and accurate records. So test agent or investigational project accountability, also nominally called drug accountability, is one of the key items to adequately maintain records of. You need to know the disposition of the drug, the dates, the quantity, and its use by subject. If the investigation is terminated, suspended, or when it's completed, the PI also has to return those supplies to the sponsor unless the sponsor says they should be destroyed. And then you have to do so under their guidance. Source documentation. Clearly, you need to have good, accurate records of the subjects, their case histories, their medical histories, their physical examination, and any other observations during the study. And the overall moniker to remember, if it's not written, it does not exist. So you have to make sure this is written, dated, signed information. Record retention. You need to retain the records for the period of time until the marketing application, the NDA, is done, and for some studies, like bioequivalent studies, even for many years following. Sometimes you rely on the sponsor to give you some indication about the record retention. It could also be moved off-site, and as long as the records can be retrieved very quickly for inspection by either the sponsor, the FDA, or anyone else that is qualified to do so. The eighth commitment is ensuring the IRB is compliant. So the principal investigator needs to make sure that the IRB is reviewing the documents, that it's composed appropriately, and that it's maintaining its review, and it also agrees to submit to the continuing review of the IRB if the clinical investigation is ongoing. The purpose of an IRB, it's a board or committee composed of a very specific composition that is designated to review, to approve, and to follow the conduct of the research being conducted. And the primary purpose isn't really for the quality of the research or the scientific content. The primary purpose is to assure that the subjects are being protected. Their rights and welfare are being protected. Continuing on item 8, you also agree to promptly report to the IRB any changes in the research activity, any unanticipated problems involving risks to human subjects. So that means if there's any problem getting drug, any problem with unexpected AEs, does the sponsor halt the study for some reason, does the FDA halt the study for some reason, those all have to be reported to the IRB in a timely fashion. There is also a continuing review. So the PI needs to keep the IRB apprised of the study progress with interim reports if need be, reporting AEs, interim safety reports from the sponsor, changes to the protocol, the consent form, the investigator's brochure or package insert, any protocol deviations, and also to provide a final study report at the conclusion of the study. The third part of this eighth obligation is any changes in the protocol. So if the protocol is changed by the sponsor, the IRB needs to re-review it and reapprove it, unless in the one instance where there's an apparent immediate hazard to the human subjects in the study. So again, the protocol amendment or modification cannot be implemented until the IRB approves it. Minor changes with no risk to the subjects can be done on an expedited fashion. And again, the only exception to this rule is if there's immediate danger to the subject and waiting for IRB review would put them in immediate danger. Finally, the ninth commitment or obligation of the PI as signed under the 1572 is to agree to comply with all other requirements regarding the obligations of the investigators and all other pertinent requirements of the CFR. This is sort of the catchphrase that is the miscellaneous commitment. And again, just to refresh, for new drugs or biologics, it's under 21 CFR Part 312, and these are the subparts or subsections that oversee these areas of the clinical investigation. For devices, it's 21 CFR Part 812, and these are the subparts that oversee the conduct of the clinical research investigation. So the third part of this presentation is going over the FDA or ICH guidance, which was published in 1996, also known as ICH E6. And this is really the bread and butter or the nuts and bolts of good clinical practice and how to conduct the clinical research. Within this GCP guidance, there are 4 subsections of the ICH. The ICH was the International Conference of Harmonization. It was conducted in the mid-90s with representation from the major markets in the world, the United States, Japan, and Europe. And they broke down the ICH guidances into 4 sections: the Q or quality topics, the S or safety topics, the E or efficacy topics, and the M or multidisciplinary topics. And they were covering the items shown on this slide. For this discussion, I am not going through all of the ICH guidances because clearly that is a full day discussion, but ICH guidance E6, which is good clinical practices, and that has to do with studies in human beings. There are 12 different ICH E topics as delineated here. The one we're talking about is E6. Within E6, there's a breakdown of 8 different topics: the glossary, the principles, the IRB, the investigator, the sponsor, the trial protocol, the IB, and other essential documents. Each of these is a subsection of the E6 guidance. The one I am focusing on today has to do with the investigator. That's item 4. And within that item, there are 13 subsections. So within the E6 guidance, on the investigator, there are these 13 subjects that have to do with the investigator qualifications and so forth listed on this slide. I'm going to go through each of these 13 items in a very summary fashion. I suggest that if you are in the business of being a principal investigator, that you have a copy of E6 and you actually read it word for word, each of these 13 subsections. So the first subsection is investigator's qualifications. This means that the investigator is properly qualified to assume the responsibilities, knowledgeable about the drug, complies with the regulations, and has the list of staff that he feels or she feels is qualified, trained to take on this investigation. And that PI has delegated the responsibilities and has a list called a delegation log of those responsibilities and who is doing what. The second of these 13 responsibilities is the adequacy of resources, also called the feasibility assessment. So the PI is assessing that their facility can do this study quite well. They can recruit the subjects, the study participants, SP, in sufficient numbers and on time. There's sufficient time to complete the study. There's enough staff, enough facilities to do the study well, and that the staff is qualified, trained, and knows about both the protocol and the test agent or investigational product. The third responsibility is the medical care of the study participants. All the medical decisions are made by qualified physicians, whether it's the PI or whether it's a delegated physician under his responsibility. The primary physician of the study participant is notified regarding of their participation. The PI knows when and why a study participant leaves the study, and all study participants are accounted for. So it's knowledge of the study participants in the trial. The PI is also responsible for the medical care when there are adverse events, and again, can delegate that to other specialists or subspecialists if appropriate. So what are these adverse events? As I had mentioned, this is one of the key responsibilities of the PI in the conduct of the study, to know the signs and symptoms that occur for the investigational product, to assess each of the subjects, to assign responsibility or association with the test product or investigational product, to look at the lab results, to know what the values are, what the reference ranges are, to be aware of potential intercurrent illnesses, and to try to decipher those out from the drug assessment or AE assessment in relation to the drug compound. And also to look at other study conditions that may be occurring. The fourth responsibility, again, of the E6 investigator, Section 4, 13 different responsibilities, this is the fourth one, is the communication with the IRB, Investigational Review Board, or the International Ethics Committee. And this is that there is written approval before the study begins, that the informed consent is in the language of the study subject or participant. The IRB needs to have the IB, any other documents, and needs to be informed immediately of any serious adverse events. Also that the protocol amendment is submitted on time, and the IRB gets at least an annual report of each study. As you could tell, some of these obligations and responsibilities that are delineated in this E6 document was also mentioned previously in the Form 1572 and the new recent guidance. That's not an accident. The fifth investigator responsibility here is the compliance with the protocol. The investigator needs to have a signed protocol confirming the agreement to comply with it to the letter. It is not a guide. It is a written document that needs to be followed exactly, not with improvisations. You cannot deviate from the protocol without written agreement from the sponsor and the IRB, with the one exception made previously of a serious consequence, safety consequence to the subject. And you have to document every deviation made from the protocol. So what does the PI review in terms of documents? As mentioned at the outset, the PI has to review the statement of the investigator, that's the Form 1572, the study protocol and all its amendments, the informed consent and all its modifications, any promotional literature, any other materials, any correspondence with the IRB, any AEs or serious AEs, and they also have to know the case report forms. If you're not sure what ALCOA is, stay tuned and we'll be getting to that. The sixth item is the investigational product, the drug or the device. You are accepting, the PI is accepting responsibility for the product, its usage, and its storage. A pharmacist should take care of the drug product under the PI supervision. You need to explain yourself or through your staff to the study participants the use of the test agent or investigational product. You need to maintain detailed records or drug accountability throughout the study, and also retain the investigational product or test agent until it's destroyed or returned to the sponsor. The investigational product accountability or drug accountability or test article accountability has been found to be deficient in almost 30% of studies that the FDA has inspected. These are some of the suggestions on how to prevent this. Allocate the treatment according to the numbers, keep detailed records, take note and follow storage requirements, keep detailed dispensing records, instruct the study participant to return unused med, keep records of what's returned, explain in detail anything missing, and return what is unused to the sponsor. The seventh item is the randomization or unblinding procedure. So the randomization procedure has to be documented in the protocol and followed exactly. The randomization code is only broken in accordance with the protocol and applicable SOPs and only for subject safety reasons. That is until the study is over. If it's blinded, any unblinding has to be clearly documented and the sponsor notified in writing. The informed consent process. This is also one of the key responsibilities of the PI. You need to ensure that the Declaration of Helsinki and the principles of GCP are observed. There's no coercion. The subject understands the information as it's presented by qualified staff. You need to make sure that the process is appropriate. It's signed and dated by the study participant and their legal representative. Some of the elements of the informed consent process. That it's a competent individual, that they receive and understand the information, appreciate the alternatives of doing the study or not doing the study, and can make a reasonable choice, that they're a mentally sound mind and understand the choices and can make that choice. You have to have full disclosure about the study and alternatives. You have to make sure there's complete understanding of the study and that it's really a voluntary agreement, not any coercion, and that the signature authorizes this agreement. There are 5 Ds of the informed consent process. The first one really isn't a D, but it's an E. It's the establishment of an atmosphere that fosters the voluntariness and establishes the relationship with the study participant, that it is truly voluntary, that it is not coercive, that they don't need to do this, but that it's truly a voluntary act. You need to determine the legal capacity and competence of the informed consent participant. You need to fully disclose the risks and benefits and alternatives, define clearly what the procedures are that they would be undergoing, and to make sure that you document what the subject wants to do, whether they've agreed to it or not. They cannot be coerced. The 9th responsibility has to do with records and reporting. As I mentioned before, the data is ALCOA. ALCOA is not just an aluminum company. It means accurate, legible, contemporaneous, original, and attributable. So the data needs to be all of these things and complete. The data on the CRFs needs to be exactly the same as what is found in the source document. Any change to a CRF needs to be dated and signed such that the original data is not obscured. There needs to be a tracking of the original data through the current data. And all essential documents are retained for at least 2 years after the last approval of the test agent for market. The original source documents must be cared for under the PI's direction. These are some of the rules and regulations that most people involved in clinical research know like the back of their hand. You never erase or overwrite. You use a single horizontal line to strike through errors. No blank spaces, no loose pages. Entries are legible. Corrections are clearly made. Subject identifiers are consistent. And any time you enter data, you need to initial it and date it. The 10th and 11th have to do with progress reports and safety reporting. So the investigator needs to submit to the IRB at least annually, or if there's any significant changes in the trial conduct. For safety reporting, as I mentioned, SAE and AE reporting is some of the key functions of the principal investigator. SAEs need to be reported immediately. AEs critical to the safety evaluation also need to be reported. As mentioned, AEs are one of the key ways the investigator has of monitoring the safety of the subjects, and they are attributed in terms of their likelihood to be caused by the test article or the investigational product by the following algorithm. Either almost certainly clearly related to it, or possibly related, probably related, unlikely, or unrelated. The 12th investigator responsibility has to do with premature stopping or suspending of the study. All study participants are informed if the study is terminated or suspended. The IRB, the sponsor, and the institution can all terminate the study. If the PI terminates the study, the others need to be notified. If the IRB if the sponsor terminates it, then the IRB and the site needs to be notified. And if the IRB terminates the study, then the others need to be notified in writing. Finally, the 13th investigator responsibility is a final report by the investigator. So at the end of the study, the PI is expected to file a written report, and this should contain the introduction, the description of the methods, the results, and the discussion of the findings. Of greatest importance to the investigator is the section that has to do with the adverse experiences and their relationships to the test article. So one of the summary comments I just wanted to make as we're concluding this discussion is the 3 references I cited, the most recent FDA guidance from this past year, the statement of the investigator, which the investigator needs to sign, and the 1996 ICH E6 guidance has a lot of overlap and some of the same themes as you would hope and expect to occur. And hopefully this presentation did emphasize that overlap, and you heard some of the same themes coming through. One of my final thoughts is trust is fundamental to good research. This I call the good. If you lose this trust, it has some bad effects on the research. And once it's lost, that trust is lost, it's nearly impossible to regain it, and that is the ugly. So now I will ask you to submit any questions through the lower right-hand chat box on your screen. And while I wait for these questions, another way to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, we have one question here. asking about how you would verify the level of training for staff. I think each site needs to do this to make sure that they have SOPs that the staff is trained on, that they have a quality system that ensures that they receive all their SOP training, that they have a history of work and licenses and qualifications that's appropriate to their duties. If they're physicians or nurse practitioners, they need to have licenses for the state in which they're practicing. If they're laboratory people, they need to have experience and appropriate qualifications. Another question came in about the investigator certifications. There are a number of certifications that are available. They have not been uniformly accepted and required, but as most things these days, there is a growing trend towards having these having these certifications. I think there's a couple of main ones that you could search on. SOCRA is one. In the ACPU, our Association of Clinical Pharmacology Units, we are looking into providing some principal investigator certifications, as well as the SOCRA one, which is more for clinical research personnel. Another question came in about how does the PI document that he's adequately supervising the designees. One of the ways to do that is to have the meetings and have people sign in at the meetings to show the staff has been prepared with the site initiation visit, that they know about the drug, that they know about the protocol. Another question, the appropriateness or inappropriateness of delegation by the PI. That's a little bit of a slippery slope. Clearly, you need to use some judgment as to who you would trust to be delegated. Part of this has to do with the experience of the investigative site, the staff, and the PI, what their previous experience has been. Okay, there's one question here. I'm sorry. About first dosings. In our particular site, we like to have the physician present for first dosings in man. That could depend upon the local site's SOPs. There's a question about how long should the physician be available. My particular recommendation and that of our site depends on the experience with the drug, the half-life of the drug, the potential side effects of the drug, the route of the drug, who else is covering the study. So it's a myriad of factors, should be delineated in the site's SOP, could also be specified in the protocol. Updates to the FDA guidance. I am not aware of that. The FDA typically does have guidances and updates, and it's probably on their website, but I am not privy to any inside information on that. One question said that the protocol trumps local regulations. Do you believe that study personnel go beyond their licensing? what I was referring to, I don't think study personnel could ever go beyond their licensing. What I was referring to is if they're licensed to do certain tasks, but the study protocol asks for someone of higher qualifications to do that task. Even though they're licensed to do that in the state, the protocol will trump the state's guidance, and you need to follow the protocol's guidance. The protocol cannot allow or supersede things that are not proper or allowed in that state. There's one question about the appropriate qualifications in the guidance. And my response, and I cannot speak for the FDA, it's the FDA's guidance, but my interpretation is that as long as the person is appropriately qualified, you can delegate those responsibilities. I have another question came in about being involved in an FDA inspection for a phase 1 study. We have been involved in that. Usually FDA inspections are conducted on pivotal trials, and that's usually phase 3 studies. The FDA usually does not inspect phase 1 studies, but occasionally they do and occasionally they can. But usually that is not the case. One question has to do with the pharmacogenetic laboratory. If the genetic lab, does the genetic lab need to be listed on the FDA 1572 form if the results are not sent to the PI and the site? Don't really know that answer factually. I would imagine, since they're involved in the study, that it would need to be, but I would have to research that and get back to whoever submitted that question. I'm trying to answer all the questions I can. If I don't get to your question, I will, in the next day or two, go through them and respond to you by email. Another question came in about the SOPs of the sponsor and the site. In my experience, the SOPs of the site usually supersede that of the sponsor if they contradict. I have had some exemptions from the sponsor's SOPs to keep the site SOP intact, since usually if the staff is trained on the site's SOPs and they're well schooled in it and that's the way they follow it, the sponsor usually agrees to follow the site's usual procedures. If there's a direct contradiction, then of course that needs to be discussed a priori, and that's one of the reasons the sponsor typically reviews the SOPs of the site. But in all my years of experience and studies, there haven't been too many, if I could think of, that are actually contradictory. There's sometimes different variations, more than one way to skin a cat, and usually in my experience the sponsor is okay with the site carrying it out as long as they get the high quality data. How frequently does GCP training need to occur? I don't know if I actually saw a specific regulation for that. I think, good practice is to do it at least annually. In my own practice, we try to have monthly refreshers on particular topics, sort of ongoing training, and pick, whether it's AE monitoring or dosing medication or, how to put in intravenous catheters, some kind of training on a regular basis so that it's not all fresh and new every year. And I think obviously any new employee needs to go through the training and be certified and take whatever quizzes or in-person testing that is done by the GCP trainer at that site. So bottom line to the question, I do not know whether the regs specify a time frame. How much of the presentation applies to investigator-initiated studies? What are the key variances? I don't recall seeing anything that separates out investigator-initiated studies from sponsor studies. I think regardless of who's sponsoring it, whether it's the investigator himself or herself or a sponsor company, the principles still apply. Any other questions coming up? Let me see, I'm going through my list here. We have about 3 minutes left. There is a question about the coordinator qualifications. Again, SOCRA, or I don't want to mention any one certifying agency because there are a number of them, have certain qualifications for coordinators. I was previously at a university, and the IRB there provided qualifications for coordinators. Also commented that CPI, the certification for principal investigators, is through the APPI, which is the physician part of the ACRP. That's another type of certification. There was a question about that. The Association of Clinical Research Professionals and the American Physician. Is it okay for Is it okay for the PI to delegate training of the sub-Is? Yes, as long as they're comfortable with the appropriate training. And if I was the PI, I would want to know that sub-I pretty well and make sure that they've participated in other studies and have a track record and know the procedures and know clinical research. Is there any minimum qualifications for CRAs, or is it sponsor specific? There are certifications for CRAs. I can't recite what those minimum qualifications are, but if you go to the websites of those organizations, I'm sure they will highlight and discuss those. I've seen courses for 8 weeks every Saturday to become a certified CRA. I've seen other types of CRA certification programs. Okay, I think we're winding down here. Oh. I'm told we have 2 minutes left and 2 more questions. Do you think the FDA oversight over tobacco will result in new guidance? I don't know the answer about the FDA oversight over tobacco. My general sense is it takes a long time to change regulations. Okay, someone commented that for investigator-initiated studies, it is DHHS 45 CFR 46 that applies. So I thank you for that comment. If nothing else, I will thank you for your participation. It looks like it is just about 2 o'clock, and want to wish everyone a happy and healthy 2010, productive, and hopefully it is a better economic year than 2009 was and 2008 for sure.